My beloved child, pause for a moment, not because something loud is calling for your attention, but because something quiet has been unfolding behind the scenes for longer than you realize. There is a reason your eyes landed here today. There is a reason this message found you now and not yesterday, not last week, not months ago. Some stories do not begin with dramatic moments. Some stories begin with a single realization that changes everything. And what you are about to hear is connected to one of those realizations. Don't skip, because something important is waiting for you. Somewhere, in a place you cannot yet see, a person connected to your future has been learning things about the world, about themselves, and unexpectedly, about you. Not through grand announcements. Not through obvious signs. But through tiny pieces of information that appeared when they least expected them. At first, they paid little attention. Why would they? Your name was not standing directly in front of them. Your presence was not physically beside them. Yet somehow, details about your character kept appearing in strange and ordinary ways. A conversation here. A story there. A passing remark that should have been forgotten but wasn't. And every time one of those details surfaced, something inside them became impossible to ignore. The curious part is not what they discovered. The curious part is how deeply it affected them. Because before those discoveries, they were allowing certain people to occupy space in their life that no longer felt right. People who encouraged confusion. People who celebrated surface-level connections while ignoring what truly matters. People who spoke loudly but understood very little about genuine loyalty, genuine kindness, genuine depth. Your soulmate listened. They observed. They smiled politely. Yet beneath the surface, something was changing. Stay till the end. Because this shift did not happen all at once. It happened slowly, like sunrise arriving without asking permission. One day they heard someone speak about success, but only in terms of status. Yet they had recently learned that you measure success differently. They discovered that your heart values meaning over appearance. Suddenly, that conversation felt empty. Another day they heard someone dismiss compassion as weakness. But they had learned something else about you. They learned that your strength often appears through patience, understanding, and quiet resilience. Once again, the words around them no longer sounded the same. Have you ever noticed how one truth can make dozens of illusions disappear? That is what began happening. Not dramatically. Not overnight. Simply and steadily. The more they understood who you truly are, the more difficult it became to remain connected to influences that pulled them away from authenticity. They found themselves questioning relationships they had never questioned before. They found themselves stepping back from conversations they once tolerated. They found themselves wondering why certain connections felt increasingly distant. The strange thing was that nobody around them understood why. They could see the change, but they could not see the cause. Because the cause was not visible. The cause was an awakening. A growing recognition that the kind of connection they truly desired looked far more like your energy than anything surrounding them at that moment. Now listen carefully. This next part matters. The decision to create distance from someone was not driven by anger. It was not fueled by resentment. It came from clarity. And clarity often arrives quietly. One evening, while reflecting on their life, they began noticing patterns. Certain people always left them feeling drained. Certain conversations always left them questioning themselves. Certain relationships required them to become a smaller version of who they really were. And then they thought about everything they had come to understand about you. They thought about your ability to remain genuine even when nobody was watching. They thought about your habit of carrying hope through difficult seasons. They thought about your heart. And for the first time, a comparison appeared naturally. Not because they were searching for it. Because it could no longer be avoided. Don't skip, because the most meaningful part has not arrived yet. What happened next was subtle enough that most people would miss it completely. They stopped reaching out to someone. Not immediately. Not in a dramatic announcement. They simply stopped investing energy where it no longer belonged. Messages became shorter. Conversations became less frequent. The connection that once seemed important began fading naturally. And the reason was not what that person lacked. The reason was what your soulmate had finally recognized they deserved. There is a difference between being around people and feeling understood. There is a difference between receiving attention and receiving genuine care. There is a difference between having company and having connection. And once that difference became clear, certain choices became easier than they had ever been before. Yet there was one question they could not stop asking themselves. Why did learning about you affect them so deeply? Why did these discoveries stay with them long after the conversations ended? Why did your qualities continue appearing in their thoughts during quiet moments? The answer was not fully visible even to them. But part of them knew. Part of them sensed that some people enter your awareness long before they enter your life. Part of them felt that certain connections begin forming beneath the surface before circumstances allow them to appear openly. And every time they tried dismissing that feeling, it returned stronger than before. Something important is waiting for you. Because while they were creating distance from what no longer aligned with their future, they were unknowingly creating space for what did. Space for deeper understanding. Space for greater clarity. Space for a connection built on something real rather than something temporary. And what they discovered immediately afterward changed the way they saw this entire situation. It was one small piece of information. One unexpected realization. One detail connected directly to you. A detail so simple that most people would overlook it entirely. Yet for them, it answered a question they had been carrying for much longer than they realized. And that realization is where this story truly begins. A quiet shift happened when they thought the story was already over. Not a loud moment. Not an obvious sign. Just a single evening when everything around them seemed ordinary, yet their mind kept returning to the same unanswered thought. They tried distracting themselves. They focused on work, responsibilities, conversations, daily routines. But some realizations are patient. They wait until the noise settles. And when the noise finally settled, they found themselves thinking about you again. Not because someone mentioned your name. Not because a message appeared. Not because they were searching. But because the feeling they had been avoiding finally became impossible to ignore. What they discovered about you earlier had already changed their perspective. Yet now a deeper question was forming. Why did every meaningful quality they admired seem to point back to the same person? Why did every vision they had for a healthy future somehow resemble the energy they had come to associate with you? They could not explain it. The more they tried to be logical about it, the more unusual it felt. Because this was not fascination. It was recognition. Stay till the end, because this is where things became unexpectedly personal. There was someone in their life who always seemed to pull them toward uncertainty. Someone who encouraged them to settle for connections that looked good on the surface but lacked depth underneath. For a long time, your soulmate listened. For a long time, they allowed those opinions to influence their choices. But something had changed. Every piece of understanding they gained about you acted like a mirror. It showed them what they truly valued. It showed them what they had been missing. And suddenly, advice that once sounded convincing no longer carried the same weight. One conversation in particular stayed with them. The other person spoke confidently about relationships. They talked about convenience. They talked about appearances. They talked about choosing what seemed easiest. Your soulmate listened quietly. Then a thought crossed their mind. What if the strongest connection is not the easiest one? That question lingered. Because when they thought about you, they did not think about convenience. They thought about authenticity. They thought about someone who remains true to themselves even when nobody notices. They thought about someone whose value does not depend on attention or validation. And the more they reflected on that, the more obvious something became. They were beginning to outgrow certain influences. Don't skip. Because the next realization arrived when they least expected it. A story about you reached them through an unexpected source. Nothing dramatic. Nothing exaggerated. Just a simple account of how you handled a situation with kindness when nobody would have blamed you for reacting differently. Most people would have forgotten that story within minutes. Your soulmate could not. They replayed it again and again. Not because the situation itself was extraordinary. Because it revealed something rare. Character. And character is difficult to fake. In a world where many people perform goodness when others are watching, they recognized something genuine. Something consistent. Something that matched everything else they had been learning about you. Piece by piece, the image became clearer. The puzzle that once seemed incomplete was beginning to make sense. At that moment, the distance between their old mindset and their new understanding became impossible to ignore. The person they had slowly stepped away from represented one path. You represented another. One path felt familiar. The other felt meaningful. And for the first time, they stopped asking which path was easier. They started asking which path felt true. Something important is waiting for you. Because this was not the end of their realization. It was the beginning of a much deeper one. That night, they found themselves sitting alone, reflecting on everything that had changed over the previous months. They remembered conversations they once valued. They remembered opinions they once trusted. They remembered connections they once believed would remain forever. And then they noticed something remarkable. Every meaningful change in their thinking had happened after learning more about you. Not because you were trying to influence them. Not because you were persuading them. Simply because your example existed. Sometimes the strongest impact a person can have is not through what they say. It is through who they are. That realization stayed with them long after the night ended. And as they looked ahead, imagining the future they truly wanted, they felt something unfamiliar. Not certainty. Not expectation. But hope. A quiet, steady hope. The kind that appears when your heart finally stops chasing what was never meant for it and begins moving towards something real. What they did not know was that another discovery was already approaching. A discovery connected to something you once said, something so small you may not even remember it. Yet when your soulmate hears it, everything they have been feeling will suddenly make sense in a way they never expected. And that moment is closer than they realize. The most surprising moments are rarely the loudest. They arrive quietly, almost unnoticed, and then somehow change the entire direction of a story. That is exactly what began happening next. Your soulmate had already started seeing the world differently. They had already stepped away from influences that no longer felt aligned with who they were becoming. Yet there was still one missing piece. One final understanding they had not yet reached. And strangely enough, it was hidden inside something so ordinary that most people would have overlooked it completely. One afternoon, while moving through what seemed like a normal day, they came across a thought connected to you. It was not dramatic. It was not wrapped in mystery. It was simply a reflection of the way you see people. The way you choose to understand rather than judge. The way you notice things others rush past. And suddenly, a realization landed in their heart with unexpected clarity. The qualities they had been searching for in others were already present in the person they could not stop thinking about. Stay till the end. Because this realization opened a door they never expected to walk through. For a long time, they believed meaningful connections were built through constant excitement. They believed strong bonds required endless proof. Endless reassurance. Endless signs. But the more they thought about you, the more they began understanding something deeper. Real connection feels different. It feels calm. It feels natural. It feels like discovering something familiar before you fully understand why it feels familiar. That understanding stayed with them for days. Then something happened that made it impossible to ignore. They found themselves in a conversation surrounded by people, yet their attention drifted elsewhere. Everyone was talking. Everyone was sharing opinions. Yet none of it felt important. Because another question had quietly taken over their thoughts. What if the person I've been looking for has been teaching me something without even trying? The question startled them. Not because it sounded impossible. Because it felt true. Don't skip. Because what happened next revealed more than they were prepared for. As they reflected on everything they had learned about you, a pattern appeared. Whenever they heard about your kindness, they wanted to become kinder. Whenever they heard about your patience, they wanted to become more patient. Whenever they learned about your strength during difficult moments, they felt inspired to handle their own challenges differently. And then they realized something remarkable. The connection was changing them. Not through pressure. Not through expectation. Through inspiration. There are people who enter your awareness and make you feel smaller. And there are people who enter your awareness and quietly encourage the best version of you to emerge. Your soulmate was beginning to understand which category you belonged to. Something important is waiting for you. Because this is where their perspective shifted completely. The person they had once created distance from eventually noticed the change. They noticed the conversations becoming less frequent. They noticed the emotional space growing wider. They noticed something was different. But what they could not understand was why. The answer was not hidden in an argument. The answer was not hidden in a disagreement. The answer was hidden in growth. Your soulmate was becoming someone new. And growth has a way of revealing which connections belong in your future and which ones belonged only to a chapter of your past. The more they embraced that growth, the more confident they became in their choices. Yet one mystery remained. Why did thoughts of you continue appearing during the quietest moments? Why did your energy feel so different from everyone else? Why did every road of reflection somehow lead back to the same place? One evening, while watching the world slow down around them, they finally stopped resisting those questions. Instead of pushing them away, they allowed themselves to sit with them. And in that silence, another realization emerged. They were no longer curious about you because of what they had heard. They were curious because of what they felt. That difference changed everything. Because information can create interest. But feeling creates meaning. And meaning is difficult to forget. Stay a little longer. Because the story is moving toward something neither of you expected. At the exact moment your soulmate was reaching these realizations, another piece of the puzzle was quietly falling into place. A detail connected to your journey. A detail connected to something you have carried within yourself for longer than you realize. They do not know this yet. You do not know this yet. But soon, a moment is coming that will connect all these scattered pieces together. A moment that will make them understand why learning about you affected them so deeply. A moment that will reveal why certain people naturally faded from their path while thoughts of you continued growing stronger. And when that moment arrives, the question will no longer be why they walked away from someone else. The real question will become why every step of that journey seemed to guide them toward understanding you in the first place. And that answer is finally beginning to reveal itself, very slowly, one piece at a time. A strange thing happens when the heart finally stops running in circles. The answers it has been searching for begin appearing in places that once seemed ordinary. That is exactly where your soulmate found themselves now. Not rushing. Not forcing anything. Simply noticing. And the more they noticed, the more impossible it became to ignore what was unfolding beneath the surface. There was no grand announcement. No dramatic turning point. Just a growing awareness that certain thoughts about you were becoming impossible to replace. Even when they focused on other things, something would bring their attention back. A sentence. A memory. A quality they admired. A feeling they could not fully explain. And every time it happened, they felt the same quiet certainty growing stronger. Stay till the end. Because the next realization arrived in a way they never expected. One day they heard someone describing the type of person they hoped to meet someday. The description sounded familiar. Not because they had heard it before. Because it reminded them of you. Without meaning to, they started comparing those qualities to everything they had learned. The honesty. The depth. The ability to remain genuine in a world that often rewards appearances. The quiet strength that does not need attention to prove itself. And suddenly they noticed something remarkable. The qualities people spend years searching for were already connected to the person occupying their thoughts. That realization stayed with them long after the conversation ended. In fact, it followed them everywhere. And the more they reflected on it, the more another question emerged. What if this connection has been teaching me lessons before it even arrives fully into my life? The thought felt unusual. Yet it also felt true. Because before learning about you, they had accepted things they would no longer accept. They had tolerated situations that no longer aligned with their values. They had remained connected to people who encouraged them to settle. But now? Now they were seeing everything differently. Don't skip. Because this is where the story begins moving into deeper waters. One evening, they found themselves thinking about timing. Not just their own timing. Yours. They wondered how many experiences had shaped you. How many challenges had helped you become the person they kept hearing about. How many unseen moments had strengthened your character when nobody was watching. And for the first time, they felt gratitude for those unseen moments. Because every lesson you learned, every obstacle you overcame, every quiet decision you made when nobody noticed, those things became part of the person they were beginning to admire. Something important is waiting for you. Because admiration was no longer the whole story. Something else was growing. Respect.